In a world where power and wealth decide who gets heard, one single mother, underestimated and invisible to the elite, will uncover a secret capable of destroying empires. This is not just a story of survival. It's the story of how a waitress turned humiliation into the downfall of billionaires. The Metropolitan Hotel in Manhattan shimmered like a jewel that night, its grand ballroom transformed into a palace of wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across the marble floors, while walls draped in velvet absorbed the quiet hum of classical music. Baccarat crystal glasses clinked as servers poured vintage champagne, each drop more expensive than most people's rent. At the center table, decorated with rare orchids and glittering cutlery, sat the architects of an $8 billion merger. Billionaires, lawyers, and shareholders laughed with the confidence of people who believed the world itself bent to their will. Among them moved a young woman in a plain black uniform. Her name was Kesha Johnson, 25 years old. Her curly hair tied into a discreet bun, she blended into the background like part of the decor. Her movements were precise, graceful even, as she filled glasses and adjusted napkins. To the guests, she was invisible, just another servant gliding silently in the periphery. They didn't see the sharp mind behind those quiet eyes or the dignity that no amount of mockery could erase. But mockery was exactly what they gave her. A platinum-haired woman whispered with a smirk as Kesha bent to pour champagne. "Be careful, not to knock anything over, dear. That glass is worth more than his monthly salary." The words drew shrill laughter, high-pitched and cruel, laughter that assumed the target was too small to matter. At another table, two women eyed Kesha's shoes, scuffed from long shifts across 3 jobs. One of them whispered loudly, "Look at the state of them. She clearly has no business here." Her friend giggled, adding, "I bet she's just waiting to pick up leftovers for her kid at home." More laughter followed, sharp as broken glass, designed to slice into her dignity. Kesha didn't react. Her face remained calm, her hands steady as she set down another glass. But inside, every word struck like a stone. She had endured this kind of cruelty before, from teachers who assumed she wasn't smart enough for advanced classes, to employers who treated her as if her thoughts had no weight. Yet every insult only added fuel to a fire she had carried since childhood. Her grandmother Dorothy had raised her in the Bronx, cleaning offices at night and reminding her granddaughter of one. Truth, education was the inheritance no one could steal. Dorothy's words echoed even when exhaustion made Kesha want to give up. Her father, Professor Marcus Johnson, had carried the same fire. A leading expert in behavioral economics, he used to sit at their kitchen table late into the night, warning her of the hidden traps buried inside financial contracts. "It seems harmless, daughter," he once told her, his desk cluttered with books and papers, "but a single clause can destroy an empire in 30 days. She was only a teenager then, but she never forgot his warning. When Marcus Johnson died in a car accident, Kesha was just 17. All she had left were his notes, his books, and his lessons. While her classmates celebrated their youth, she worked multiple jobs, waiting tables, cleaning offices, anything to keep going. At night, when her daughter Brooklyn was finally asleep, she studied economics, business law, financial history, page after page, year after year, until the words became part of her. Every insult, every doubt, only made her sharper. Now, standing in that glittering ballroom, surrounded by people who dismissed her as invisible, those lessons would collide with fate. As Kesha leaned over to refill a glass at the head table, her eyes caught the thick stack of papers in front of Richard Whitmore, the Billionaire host. The merger agreement, celebrated as the deal of the year, sat like a trophy in the center of the table. To anyone else, it was a jungle of incomprehensible legal language. But to Kesha, one line leapt from the page like fire. She froze, her heart skipping. A reverse transfer clause, buried deep inside the contract, disguised by technical wording. Her father's voice whispered in her memory. Learn to read between the lines. They hide traps in plain sight. She knew exactly what it meant. In 30 days, Whitmore's empire could be stripped bare. Everything, the assets, the shares, even personal holdings, gone. Her breath tightened, and for a brief moment she considered walking away. After all, what chance did a waitress have in a room like this? But then she thought of Brooklyn. She thought of her grandmother scrubbing floors with swollen hands. She thought of every moment she had been told to stay in her place. And she couldn't stay silent. She leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Whitmore, don't. Sign that. For a heartbeat, the words seemed to vanish into the music. Then the table erupted. Laughter rolled like thunder, crueler than before. Executives sneered, shareholders chuckled, and the woman in the red dress whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. How embarrassing. She thinks she's in a movie. Someone should explain to her how these things work. Another man shook, his head with a grin. She probably can't even read the document properly. Should be in the kitchen, not here. Kesha felt the eyes of the entire table on her, expecting her to crumble under their ridicule. But she didn't. She stood steady, her tray balanced, her voice calm, her gaze unflinching. Inside, her father's words burned like iron. They hide traps in plain sight. She had seen the trap, and no amount of mockery could erase the truth she carried in her mind. The ballroom glittered with wealth, but at that moment, it was Kesha, the invisible waitress, who held the power no one else recognized. The laughter swelled again, rolling across the glittering ballroom like a cruel tide. Executives leaned, back in their chairs, shaking their heads at the absurdity. Lawyers polished their glasses and smirked as though the very suggestion of danger from a waitress was comedy enough. The platinum-haired woman raised her voice so the entire room could hear. She probably didn't even finish high school, she said, her words slicing the air with deliberate venom. Her friends laughed louder, emboldened by her cruelty, and one of the younger associates muttered, "Next, she'll be telling us she's a Wall Street analyst in disguise." The table roared, wine spilling from glasses as they mocked the audacity of someone who dared to speak truth from beneath a servant's uniform. The hotel manager, his face flushed with panic, rushed forward. He bent close to Kesha, his voice a desperate hiss. "Please, stop this. You're going to lose your job. Just apologize and walk away. These people—" His eyes darted nervously at the powerful faces now watching with predatory amusement. "These people could ruin you." But Kesha didn't flinch. Her hands remained steady on the tray she carried, her posture upright. She leaned slightly toward the contract, her finger hovering just above the dense block of text. "Right here," she said quietly, her voice even but firm. "This clause reverses transfer authority after 30 days. Everything you think you're gaining will be siphoned back, along with assets you never agreed to give away." The laughter faltered. Stopped, not yet, but cracked at the edges. A shareholder near the end of the table, older and slower to dismiss, pulled the contract closer. Adjusting his glasses, he traced the line she had indicated. His lips moved silently as he read, then froze. For a long moment, his brow furrowed, his hand gripping the paper tighter. When he finally looked up, his face had drained of color. "She's right," he said hoarsely. The ballroom shifted instantly. The mocking laughter cut off, replaced by an uneasy silence that spread like frost across the tables. Champagne flutes were lowered. Executives who moments ago had smirked now leaned forward, their eyes flicking nervously over the documents. Lawyers scrambled for pens, whispering urgently among themselves. A ripple of panic passed through the elites, invisible but palpable as the realization clawed at them. The waitress had seen something they had not. Kesha stood in that silence, calm and composed, though inside her chest her heart thudded like a drum. She thought of all the nights she had sat at her small kitchen table, her daughter Brooklyn asleep in the next room, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. She remembered the textbooks stacked high, the legal dictionary she bought second-hand, and the hours spent tracing her father's notes until the ink blurred in her tired eyes. Each night she had whispered to herself that one day it would matter. One day it would all mean something. Now, as the room of billionaires scrambled in, confusion, she felt that day had arrived. Her grandmother's voice floated back to her, soft and steady like the woman herself. "Honey, let them think you're small. That's how you get 10 steps ahead." Dorothy had said it after a teacher mocked Keisha in front of the class, insisting she wasn't smart enough for college. She had said it again when a landlord dismissed Kesha's questions about a rental agreement, assuming she wouldn't understand the fine print. The memory gave Keisha strength now, her spine straightening as she watched the most powerful men and women in the city whisper in fear. Still, she knew this wasn't finished. The clause was only part of the story. The way it was written, its structure, the deceptive wording, it had the fingerprints of something deeper. Her father used to tell her that not all traps were built for one fall. Some were built to dismantle dynasties. Quietly, with the calm of someone who had learned to survive storms, Kesha slipped her phone from her pocket. Shielding it beneath her tray, she opened her messages and typed a quick note to Professor Williams, her late father's closest research partner. The man had worked side by side with Marcus Johnson for decades, dissecting economic sabotage hidden inside legal frameworks. If anyone could confirm her suspicion, it was him. The reply came faster than she expected. One sentence that made her blood run cold. "This isn't a merger. It's a hostile takeover disguised to collapse Whitmore Industries. From within." Her throat tightened, but she didn't let it show. She glanced at Whitmore himself, seated at the head of the table, his expression shifting from arrogance to unease. He still held the pen, poised above the contract, though now his hand trembled faintly. Leaning closer, careful that only he could hear, Kesha spoke softly. "Mr. Whitmore, it's not just the company. They've targeted your personal assets as well. Your trusts, your estate, even your family's holdings. In 30 days, you'll own nothing." For the first time that evening, the billionaire's eyes locked onto hers without contempt, without dismissal. He didn't see a waitress now. He saw a woman who had just pulled him back from the edge of ruin. The pen in his hand lowered slowly, the contract untouched. The room still buzzed with frantic whispers, but in that quiet space between them, something shifted. The man who had once seen her as invisible now regarded her with genuine respect, and Kesha, standing in her plain black uniform, held his gaze steadily, knowing that her father's lessons had brought her here, to this moment where worlds collided and everything began to change. The doors of the ballroom swung open with a force that silenced the chaos of whispered arguments and frantic scribbling pens. All heads turned as Professor Williams entered, his tall frame commanding attention, his briefcase clutched tightly in one hand. He didn't pause to acknowledge the startled faces or the scornful glares. He walked with the steady authority of a man who had carried the weight of secrets too dangerous for ordinary people to understand. When he reached the head of the room, he snapped open his case, slid a sleek laptop onto the table, and without ceremony connected it to the projector. The vast screen behind the stage flickered to life, flooding the golden ballroom with the cold, unforgiving glow of evidence. His voice carried over the stunned silence, deliberate and sharp. What Ms. Johnson identified was not simply a poorly written clause. This contract is the centerpiece of a massive money laundering operation, designed to strip Whitmore Industries and funnel billions through shell accounts tied to international cartels. Gasps rippled through the audience, sharp intakes of breath from the very elites who had spent the evening basking in arrogance. The screen shifted again, and suddenly rows of documents appeared. Bank transfers, coded wires from offshore, accounts, transactions written in numbers that bled red with corruption. The images moved swiftly, one after another. Surveillance photos of men in tailored suits shaking hands with known cartel leaders. Shipping manifests for containers never intended to reach legitimate ports. Clips of coded conversations intercepted by federal surveillance translated into blunt, damning English. Every detail struck the room like thunder. The glitter of crystal chandeliers above seemed almost mocking now, their beauty reflecting the ugliness being exposed beneath them. Panic broke loose. Executives shoved back their chairs, desperate to leave, but the heavy doors were already being locked from the outside. Lawyers barked frantic denials, their voices tripping over each other, each one trying to disown the very contract they had moments before defended. Socialites clutched their pearls and cried openly, mascara streaking down faces that had only hours ago been lit with smug laughter. The ballroom, once a sanctuary of privilege, had transformed into a trap. And then came the heart of it. The villain revealed. Henderson, the dealmaker with the flawless smile and the booming voice, tried to keep his composure. He slammed his hand on the table, his voice cutting through the noise. "This is slander. Lies spun from a waitress and an old man desperate for relevance." But the evidence on the screen betrayed him. Page after page, every number, every photograph, every recording, all pointed to his hand in the scheme. The walls of his charm collapsed under the weight of truth. Kesha stepped forward, her hand steady though her pulse hammered in her ears. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her phone, its small size unthreatening yet holding the power to finish what had begun. With one tap, her voice filled the ballroom, not her own, but Henderson's. Clear, fluent Spanish echoed, clear across the gilded walls. "We must finish the operation before the feds arrive. Once the assets are stripped, there will be nothing left to trace." Gasps turned into shouts, fury exploding in every corner of the room. The words were undeniable. His voice, his plan, his downfall. Henderson's face drained of color as the realization set in that his own arrogance had become the noose tightening around his neck. The moment shattered into chaos as the side doors burst open. Federal agents in dark suits stormed inside, their badges glinting in the harsh light, their movements swift and precise. Commands barked in clipped voices cut through the noise as men and women were shoved to the floor, wrists bound in cold steel cuffs. Henderson fought, his protest echoing like a dying animal's cry, but he was forced down, his polished shoes scuffing against the marble as agents pinned him. Around him, other executives were seized, their designer suits no protection against. The law's grip. The ballroom was no longer a palace of wealth, it was a crime scene. Kesha stood in the center of it all, the eye of the storm. The same men and women who had mocked her only minutes before now stared with wide eyes, not of derision, but of awe and fear. They had underestimated her, dismissed her, ridiculed her. Now they saw her for what she was, the woman who had pulled back the curtain and revealed the monsters hiding in plain sight. Their silence spoke louder than any apology could. At the head of the room, Whitmore himself rose slowly to his feet. The color had drained from his face, his hands trembling slightly as he brushed them down the front of his suit. He looked at her as though truly seeing her for the first time. His voice, raw with sincerity, broke through the fading chaos. "You didn't just save my company. You saved my life." Kesha's gaze held his, calm and unwavering. She had no need for triumph, no need for gloating. Her words were simple, steady, and filled with the quiet dignity that had carried her through every hardship. "Hire people for what they know," she said softly, her voice carrying across the stunned room, "not for what they look like." The words hung in the air long after the agents dragged Henderson and his co-conspirators away, long after the glittering elites lowered their heads, in shame. The storm had broken, and in its wake, only the truth remained. 6 months had passed since that night in the ballroom, yet its echoes still lingered across the city's business circles like a storm that had left behind broken glass and shattered reputations. Henderson, once the untouchable dealmaker, now woke each day behind concrete walls and iron bars. His empire of charm and deceit had collapsed into the silence of a prison cell. Dr. Beck, the lawyer who had sneered at Keisha's every word, faced his own downfall. Disgraced and stripped of his license, he was reduced to a footnote in the very industry where he had once strutted with arrogance. The mighty had fallen, and no one mourned them. For Whitmore Industries, however, a new era had begun. At the center of it stood Kesha. No longer in an apron, no longer balancing trays and biting her tongue, she now sat at the head of a polished oak desk in a corner office overlooking the skyline. The plaque on her door read, Director of Compliance. With that title came not only authority but the recognition she had always deserved. Her monthly salary was more than she had once earned in an entire year waiting tables, and with each paycheck came a reminder of how far she had traveled from the shadows others tried to trap her in. But money was never the true reward. It was the power to change things to prevent others from being silenced as she once was. From the very beginning, Kesha knew she did not want her victory to end with her. She remembered every long night she had counted tips, every cruel remark that told her she didn't belong, and she decided no one else should fight alone. She launched a trainee program inside Whitmore Industries, dedicated to youth from poor neighborhoods, young people who were told they weren't good enough, just as she had been. She taught them how to detect fraud, how to follow the paper trails that criminals thought were invisible. She showed them how to see what others ignored. Within the first 6 months, her program had solved 23 cases of corporate misconduct, saving millions that would have been stolen. For her trainees, it wasn't just about numbers on a page. It was proof that injustice could be turned into opportunity. At home, her daughter Brooklyn thrived in ways Kesha once feared might never be possible. The girl, who had been judged not for her talents but for her mother's uniform, now walked confidently through the halls of a school that valued her brilliance. She no longer carried the weight of other people's prejudice on her small shoulders. Her laughter came freely now, and when she talked about her future, she spoke of becoming a lawyer, maybe even a judge, someone who could fight from the inside out, just like her mother. For Kesha, seeing Brooklyn smile without fear was worth more than every paycheck combined. Professor Williams remained a constant presence in her life, visiting once a month, never missing the chance to remind her how proud he was. Over coffee in her office, he would lean back with the same wry smile that had once appeared in the ballroom, telling her that she had not only continued her father's legacy, but expanded it into something neither of them could have dreamed. In her office, right beside her desk, Kesha kept 2 things in a frame: a photo of her father, who had once fought tirelessly for integrity, and a thank you letter signed by the FBI acknowledging her role in dismantling one of the largest money laundering schemes in the country. Whenever doubt tried to creep in, she looked at those 2 frames and remembered why she had begun. The transformation was undeniable. She had walked into that ballroom invisible, dismissed as nothing more than a servant, a background character, in the lives of the powerful. Now, those same circles whispered her name with respect, sometimes with fear. The executives who had once laughed at her shoes and scoffed at her presence now ensured their companies followed every regulation she enforced, terrified of being the next name on her list. Kesha had become more than a survivor. She had become a guardian of truth in a world built on lies. And yet she carried her success with grace. There was no gloating, no indulgence in bitterness. She understood that true revenge was not about watching others burn. It was about building a fire of her own, one bright enough to light the way for others who had been kept in the dark. The world that had once mocked her uniform now stood in awe of her leadership, and she never let them forget the lesson. The narrator's voice draws to a close, steady and reflective. They laughed at her shoes, her uniform, her background. They laughed because they believed invisibility was weakness. But the woman they dismissed became the nightmare of white-collar criminals, a force that turned corruption into confessions and arrogance into downfall. Her revenge was not destruction, it was creation. She built something greater than her enemies ever imagined, something that will outlast them all. And in the quiet dignity of her triumph, Kesha Johnson proved that the truest power lies not in how the world sees you, but in how you choose to rise above it.